front. As special representative, we have identified priority areas that we've worked on since the last annual meeting. The rise of anti-Semitism has been one of our top priorities. And we've had numerous meetings and discussions on what we can do to counter the rise of anti-Semitism. Anti-Muslim activity has been on the rise, and we've worked on dealing with that issue. Discriminatory policing is an area that has troubled us greatly, not only in Europe, but in the United States of America. And of course, the anti-migrant sentiments and fears in the migrant community. They have been our priorities during this past year. What I hope we can do today is have a frank discussion and look at how we can develop an action plan. An action plan, to me, yes, you have to deal with the safety of vulnerable communities. And we in the Congress are working on security measures and funding security measures to protect vulnerable communities. That's first and foremost, to make sure they're safe. But we also have to recognize we have to deal with the underlying causes here. Education, investing in education is always something that we should be doing. And putting more resources into education would be very, very important. We also understand that we have to build coalitions among stakeholders, because united, we're more effective. We have a stronger voice rather than being separated in our campaigns. And we have to build capacity, particularly within the institutions of government that should be there to protect us against the rise of hate. We also need to make sure our laws are effective in dealing with these types of activities. So there's a lot of things that we can do that can make a difference. And the Parliamentary Assembly has been so effective in the past in developing action plans to deal with the tolerance agenda. It was our work that led to the creation of the 3 special representatives within the OSCE to deal with discrimination. It was our effort that created an office within ODIHR to deal with discrimination. It was our effort that led to the Berlin Conference in 2004 to lead the efforts on anti-Semitism. So I just urge us as parliamentarians to be engaged in how we can present a plan that can be effective to turn back the rhetoric. Let me just give you 2 examples. And I know my friend Congressman Harris is here, and he cautions us about naming specific countries. And you're right about that. I'm going to name 2 countries because I just visited those 2 countries. But we can name every country in the OSCE has challenges. In the UK, as I was talking to Lord Dubs, we visited Northern Ireland. The legacy between Catholics and Protestants is dangerous. We have to figure out a way to end that legacy of hate within Northern Ireland for peace. And in Hungary, which we just recently visited, their revisionist on what happened in World War II is not acceptable. The monument that they have in the center of their square that tries to cleanse the culpability of Hungarians during World War II is offensive. And then it leads to political rhetoric during a campaign that is clearly aimed at anti-Semitism. That's unacceptable. Now, again, I could go through every state. There are 2 we visited during this trip. We need to share information, and we need to share best practices. So that's where I hope this discussion will take us. I'm going to go right to our panelists. We're giving special recognition to Dr. Rebecca Earlbelden, who is from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. We're giving her a little extra time, mainly because I'm a member of the board of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, but also because at the last board meeting, an observation was made that many of the seeds that led to the Holocaust and what happened in World War II, we see growing again in 2019. Bad people can't carry out their evil agenda unless they have popular support. Something we should be thinking about. So with that, let's start our discussion and turn it over to Dr. Earlbelden.
Thank you so much for having me today, and to Senator Cardin, both for being a member of the Holocaust Museums Board and for the invitation to address you all today. German lawyer and World War II veteran Victor Klemperer, who was a converted Christian man married to a Christian woman, but he was considered Jewish by the Nazi authorities. He was one of the few Jewish men to survive the Holocaust outside of a concentration camp within Nazi Germany. And he kept very elaborate, detailed diaries. In March 1945, just 6 weeks before Germany's surrender and the end of the war in Europe, Klemperer reflected on the last 30 years. He wrote, "Have we not continually experienced, since 1914 and even more since 1933, and with even greater frequency in recent weeks, the most utterly improbable, the most monstrously fantastic things? Has not what was formerly completely unimaginable to us become commonplace and a matter of course? It's not only the word impossible that's gone out of circulation, unimaginable has no validity anymore." The Holocaust did not appear out of nowhere, and in fact, the Nazi Party was in power in Germany for 8 years before mass killing began. But the roots of the genocide were much deeper and lasted longer than 1933. Anti-Semitism, the ancient hatred, grew and morphed over the course of millennia as Jews, a people without a homeland, were subjected to pogroms. They were blamed for plagues. They were welcomed in Catholic lands as the only legal moneylenders and then kicked out when people in power wanted to erase their debts without recourse. Pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia at the end of the 19th century led to a flood of Jewish refugees into Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so this mix of ancient hatred and newer xenophobia made it really easy for Adolf Hitler to blame an imagined Jewish treachery for Germany's loss in World War I. That war, which resulted in between 15 and 19 million military and civilian casualties, further destabilized any European order that had existed. Historian Barbara Tuchman wrote, "The idea of progress was the greatest casualty of that war, and its aftermath was cynicism. This industrial revolution that had been going on before the war had led to an industrialized, brutal war. The promise of technology and the hopes that people had put into mass media and a global world, World War I shattered these and made people cynical about them. Empires were broken up, country lines redrawn according to ethnic and linguistic groups, all decided in Paris and rarely by the inhabitants of those areas. The Russian Revolution in 1917 created a new myth, that of the Jewish communist, which led to further anti-Semitic pogroms in regions threatened by communism. And throughout continental Europe, political instability after the war led to the rise of far-right and far-left parties. The center hollowed out, and it couldn't hold. In the meantime, the United States had excused itself from international affairs. The Senate refused to join the League of Nations, and the country demilitarized, vowing to never again cross the Atlantic for war. A belief in eugenic science, the idea that some people are biologically better than others, found champions among American and British scientists and politicians. The House Committee on Immigration had a staff eugenicist. In 1924, Congress set both an overall immigration cap and quotas based on an immigrant's country of birth, designating far fewer visas for countries with large Jewish and Catholic populations, and privileging countries where so-called good immigrants lived. Congress rejected any exceptions for refugees fleeing persecution. Many immigration applications were rejected outright due to race, disability, or financial status. Xenophobia, isolationism, and fear led the United States to retreat from the rest of the world. Post-World War I reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles hit Germany hard, but the roller coaster of economic crises in Europe dipped even further with the worldwide depression that began in 1929. And within this crisis, a relatively new political party in Germany, the National Socialists, began to rise. Despite their name, National Socialism was a specifically German form of right-wing populism. It was anti-Semitic, anti-liberal, and anti-communist. In a 1920 speech, Hitler called for the creation of a greater Germany, which would necessitate, he said, a return to genuine German socialism, in contrast with the class warfare socialism preached by Jewish leaders. His use of propaganda, his populist push for one big idea, that an ethnically Aryan German community could regain its former glory, and his deafness at playing to his audience, led the Nazi Party to rise in the polls. And yet Hitler was not elected. He was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933 by a conservative coalition, encouraged by German business leaders who thought they could control him and his Nazi followers. Under the guise of a national emergency to oppose a communist threat, Hitler almost immediately began a campaign of persecution. Political opponents were incarcerated in concentration camps. Dachau opened in March 1933, only 2 months after Hitler assumed the chancellery. Within months of Hitler's appointment, Jews were removed from civil service, from the practice of law and medicine, from teaching in public schools and universities. Jewish businesses were boycotted, anti-Nazi books collected and burned. The Nazi propaganda ministry excluded Jews from the media and solidified control over newspaper and radio coverage. Victor Klemperer, our Jewish lawyer and diarist, and remember, a World War I veteran, wrote, "In the war, I was subject to military law, but subject to law nevertheless. Now I am at the mercy of an arbitrary power." Nazi attacks on Jews were not secret, but were front-page news in the United States and elsewhere. Yet fear of conflict, tinged with these countries' own anti-Semitism, and in the United States, a belief that any formal protest against the Nazi treatment of Jews would lead to a German protest against America's treatment of African Americans, led these countries to stay silent. In 1935, a series of laws announced at the annual Nazi Party rally at Nuremberg stripped citizenship from Jewish Germans. It set the swastika flag as the official symbol of Germany and outlawed marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. Nazi lawyers had studied the anti-miscegenation laws in America's southern states for inspiration. These laws also affected anyone deemed racially inferior, including Roma and Sinti and Afro-Germans. By that time, anyone deemed a habitual criminal, a loose definition including alcoholics, petty criminals, and the homeless, could be imprisoned indefinitely. Jehovah's Witness organizations had been banned since witnesses would not swear loyalty to the Nazi regime. Male homosexuality was already illegal, but was penalized more heavily. And a new law for the prevention of progeny with hereditary diseases mandated the forced sterilization of people with physical and mental disabilities. In his diary, Klemperer quoted Hitler as saying in 1936, "I am not a dictator. I have only simplified democracy." What Germany was doing to its own citizens was not illegal under international law. But as Germany began to expand, annexing Austria in March 1938 and taking the Sudetenland in September 1938 with British and French approval, but not Czech approval, Nazi Germany subsumed hundreds of thousands more Jews and those who did not fit the Aryan ideal. President Roosevelt called an international conference in Evian, France in July 1938, calling 32 nations to attend to deal with this international crisis, to form some sort of way to deal with it. Nearly all of those nations, including the United States, refused to change their immigration laws. Some blamed the ongoing economic crisis for this refusal. Others stated bluntly they did not wish to import a racial problem. Although forcing Jews to immigrate was Nazi policy until 1941, immigration was nearly impossible. The Nazis stripped Jews of their wealth, making them undesirable immigrants. The war significantly decreased the ability to escape as passenger ships were unable to cross the Atlantic, and countries placed more and more restrictions on immigration in the name of national security. To Hitler, the destruction of European Jewish communities, first through immigration, and when that failed, through mass murder, was a necessary part of the war. Jews, he thought, were the ultimate enemies of a successful Germany, and Jews would undermine the Reich and its Axis partners whenever they could. The Western Allies thought that Nazi persecution was Hitler's strange and destructive obsession, but it was nothing to wage war over. And they did not comprehend the totality of the Holocaust until millions of Jews had already been killed. The Holocaust ended, and could only have ended, with the defeat of Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Since history can only be lived in one direction, it's impossible to pinpoint exactly what action could have been taken to prevent the Holocaust. But that does not give us an excuse for inaction. As Klemperer noted in the final weeks of the war, it's not only the word impossible that has gone out of circulation. Unimaginable has no validity anymore. Since the Holocaust proved the impossible possible and the unimaginable stark reality, we are compelled to look back and identify warning signs, signs which drive our concern today. The rise of populist leaders, of simple solutions, of demonizing minorities, of propagandizing hate, of neglecting or ignoring refugee protections, of isolationism, of appeasement. These factors, when taken together, have led to genocide in the past, and not just in Europe. We must stay vigilant, and through a mix of historical memory and international cooperation and coordination, work together to prevent genocide in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for giving that historical perspective. I think that's extremely important for us as we do our work today. Michael Lenk is a member of the German delegation. He is the Third Committee Vice Chair and former ODIHR Director. So he comes to this position with a great deal of experience on this agenda, and he's been very helpful in the Parliamentary Assembly on our policies to deal with anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Senator Dearban. Thank you, Senator Dearban. And I'm still impressed what we heard right now, how easily, and I speak about my own country and my own people, how easily a country, a nation which is considered to be a cultural nation can totally change its character if you don't understand the signals in the right moment. As we heard, it did not happen overnight. It did materialize in a very, very, very long process, and the first and alarming signals have not been understood. Today, we see the same. I don't say it ends in the same. It's in our hands whether it will end in the same way, but I think we need to be on the alert. When we see that in Germany, for example, we have a parliamentary group now of Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, beginning to table parliamentary motions and initiatives where they try to identify, and all these are quotes unfortunately, the diseases brought by refugees, where they try to identify the nationality of artists in terms of left-leaning, as they say, cultural protesters which they don't like in publicly funded theaters, for example. When you see how they try to identify the religion and nationality in refugee and migration areas and try to allow only migration, immigration, if they are white Christians, then I think then it's high time to be on the alert, especially when such a party is polling at 15%. I mean, that is alarming. But you have the same even on the extreme left. You have on the extreme left new forms of anti-Semitism coming in disguise of anti-Judaism, anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, this famous BDS movement which we have. So there is a reason to act, and we try to act as parliamentarians. I will briefly touch on ODIHR later, but first, what we as parliamentarians can do is indeed crucial. For example, we have in the parliament tried to put forward, and I'm an opposition MP, and we could convince the majority to go with us to say we need really a way to abolish or to prohibit BDS, this boycott, disinvest organization in Germany. It earned us a lot of criticism from the media and so on, saying that it's intolerant. But I always say freedom of speech, please don't understand it legally because the courts have another opinion, but freedom of speech ends where hate speech begins. Yeah? We need to be careful that new forms of anti-Semitism come in also in the beginning, forms that we might not detect early. So we need to be sensible. And especially in Germany, I think we have a especially high obligation to be sensible to new forms of intolerance, of racism, especially anti-Semitism, but I add it is equally valid for all forms of intolerance against Muslims, sometimes reaching into Islamophobia, and something which is also especially important because it's very often forgotten, it's intolerance and discrimination of Roma. They have always been a little bit the forgotten victims in the German debate, so it is high time also for us parliamentarians to address that. And to give you an example that we have some homework to do still in Germany is that finally 70 years after the end of the Second World War, we finally have, after the pressure of the Bundestag, a special representative of the German government for fighting anti-Semitism. A good guy, a really good guy. He's doing a terrific job, but it's coming pretty late. And we still have no special rep for fighting discrimination of Roma. Now you might say, as some do, why do we need special reps for everything different? I'm not convinced that it needs to be different, but I think we should call a problem by its name. And if you only say we want to fight discrimination, that sometimes plays into the hands of some people. I think we should call it by its name. Fighting anti-Semitism is important to call it by its name, and also to fight discrimination of Roma by its name, and discrimination of Muslims as well. And we know in the OSCE, we also have in some places discrimination and prosecution of Christians. We should also call it by its name. Therefore, we cannot spare that, and you will see, we will have discussions in the third committee tomorrow, where some delegations want to erase these special quote of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and intolerance against Christians. I would strongly argue against that. We should call the problem by its name. We try, as parliamentarians in Germany, also to address other issues, like, for example, addressing those groups of victims which still have not been sufficiently honored and respectfully treated after the Second World War. For example, all these forced laborers which had to work in Germany, or, as we discuss right now, there's a parliamentary initiative to erect a memorial for the contribution of Poland to European freedom and to European values, something which is extremely important, especially right now, where we have sometimes politically complicated discussions. ODIHR, we will hear more about that, has set up the Words into Action program. I think, consider it extremely important to be continued because it addresses the security issues of Jewish communities. We have, as German Parliament, funded that quite a lot. And, of course, anti-hate speech education and outreach also to fighting other forms of discrimination. That's also equally important. Maybe another issue would be, and maybe here the Parliamentary Assembly can be helpful, I think we really need to address the textbook issue. If you see what happens with US money and German money, US AID, German international development aid, sometimes what you find in textbooks in Palestine, in Egypt, in whatever, where sometimes, without our knowledge, our help is being used in having textbooks with anti-Semitic undertones or extremely, let's say, conceptions of family which are totally not up to the modern world. We should also be careful to see what other foreign governments are using our aid for, and to be sensible for that. I think it would be important, both inside the OSCE and outside, really to look what is being done with our money outside of the OSCE, and what can we in the OSCE area do. For example, we had, when I was director of the ODIHR, we had an extensive check of the textbooks in Hungary, how in Hungary anti-Semitic texts in textbooks can be erased. We still have that in many places, and that is a permanent job to do, because when you don't begin at school, when people have their prejudice already learning from their textbooks, then it's already too late to improve things. Therefore, I would really very much focus our engagement on education, preschool education, school education, and all these areas. So a lot of things to do for us, and thanks again for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for your presentation and for your work. Nahina Landry is the head of the Belgium delegation. She chairs the ad hoc committee on migration. God bless you for doing that. It's obviously an extremely challenging assignment, and you've done it with incredible leadership. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Okay. Dear colleagues, as you know, discrimination is still a reality worldwide, despite all the discussions that we already have had here in the Parliamentary Assembly and also in our in our home countries. We see that discrimination is widespread when people are looking for a job, when they are going out, so in a nightlife, but also when they try to rent a house, and also in so many other moments in people's daily life. Direct and indirect discriminations must be perceived as unacceptable. They are unacceptable. We have also seen what they have led to in the past. And so it's our duty to tackle discrimination on an effective manner. We may never accept the exclusion of people on the basis of racial or ethnic origin, on the basis of age or religion, because we are Jews or Muslims or Christians, or also because of the sexual orientation or disability. These acts of discrimination are not only unacceptable on the, from an ethic point of view, but it's also a waste of human talent. We need this human talent in our society, and that's why combating discrimination is also is not only a social has a social dimension, but also an economic dimension, because we need those talents in our society and also on the labor market. And many OSCE participating states have already a large anti-discrimination policy. We also have it in our country, in Belgium, since years and years. We have a range of laws that qualify acts of racism and discrimination as a criminal offense. This legislation has already proved its usefulness, but it's not enough to have a good legislation, and you all know it also in your country. And also in Belgium, we have since more than 25 years also a public and independent institution, it calls UNIA, that combats discrimination. So anyone that has been the target of discrimination or has witnessed to discrimination or hate speech can can turn to UNIA, and first UNIA will try to mediate, to have a solution without going to court. But if it's not successful, UNIA will go to court because it's a criminal offense if you discriminate or spread hate speech. But still, we notice and we see that testimonies and investigations clearly demonstrate that discrimination is not over yet. I have a note with different figures, but I will not give you now all the figures. You can see it later on the hard copy we will distribute. But for instance, last year a study showed out that in Antwerp every one of two landlords or real estate agents are discriminating because of the origin or the religion or because of the social class of a person. And also on the labor market, we see the same problems. Researchers from university showed out that people with a migrant background have 30% lower chances to be invited to a job interview compared to native candidates with the same qualification. I'm talking about candidates with the same curriculum, with the same qualification. And if the number of candidates is big enough, job applicants with white names have even 50% or more chances to be invited for an interview, even though applicants with a migrant background have the same qualifications. And these facts and figures show that discrimination is not marginal. It's despite our solid legislations that we have in several countries, and despite the institutes we have in several countries, discrimination is still widespread. And that's the reason also why why the Belgian policymakers, and I was also one of them 2 years ago, we moved into a higher gear in order to reach successful or more successful results. And that's why we introduced the so-called mystery calls on the labor market, because there's now a new law that makes it possible for social inspectors with specifics, and we give them specific powers in terms of researching and establishing discriminatory offenses in order to make it easier to prove that these offenses were committed, because everyone knows there is discrimination, but it's very hard to prove. And that's why we installed those mystery calls, and so social inspectors can go to companies, and when there is a complaint or a report, and there is an indication there is possibly a case of discrimination, then they can go and without introducing themselves, and they will show themselves as if they were candidates, and then they gather the proofs and go with this proof to court. And that's I think these mystery calls are a major step forward in our anti-discrimination policy, and I would like also to say that also in the Netherlands they have the same policy. I think it's proven it's good and quite effective. But also at the local level, you can do a lot of concrete things, like Ghent, but also in other cities in Belgium. Recently, they launched checks to tackle discrimination in the private rental market, because we also see that there is a lot of discrimination. And then they do it on two manners. You have the proactive approach without complaint, and you have also a reactive approach when there is already a complaint of discrimination. And then we have seen that the results of the investigations, that those results shows that the mere existence of these checks already leads to less discrimination. We have seen that, for instance, that discrimination regarding to people living with a disability was lowered from 21 to 15%, and the discrimination against people with a migrant background lowered from 26% to 14%. Dear colleagues, are just some examples of maybe good practices you could also implement in your home countries to tackle discrimination. So I know there's a lot, we have to do a lot of work because there is a problem of hate speech. There is, and despite all those steps we have already taken with institutes, with legislation, we still see that there is a lot of work to do, and I also hope to have with you we can change our views, and I'm looking forward to make some further steps forwards in the future. Thank you.
Naheema, thank you very much. One of the things that I will be doing as special representative is to share best practices, and you've given me many good examples of what can work in one country could be used in another country to advance this agenda. Our final speaker will be Lord Dubs. I think everyone here knows Lord Dubs. He's one of the most active members of our Parliamentary Assembly, always for a good reason, to advance OSCE principles. He does serve also, he's a member of the UK delegation and serves on the Ad Hoc Committee on Migration.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Senator, and thank you for the good work you are doing in the causes we're talking about. And I'm delighted to be sharing a platform with so many people who are eminent. 3 years ago, a Labour MP, it was during the referendum campaign, called Jo Cox, you probably know, she was murdered in her constituency. Why? Because people who hated her views, who hated the sort of things we believe in, one man, he shot her and killed her. And let me just tell you one other thing. I was on the television talking about refugees in London, and I got an electronic thing. My assistant normally stops me seeing these, but I did see this one, addressed to me. what a shame you survived the Holocaust. And then he goes on to say that my aim is to have every Muslim rapist and pernicious illegal immigrant coming to this country. Happily, you don't have long to live. Nice, isn't it? We've had that taken down. Now, look, I don't get many of those. I get a few of those. But it is a sign that there is a hostile environment. And I think it doesn't just affect the UK. I think it affects other countries as well. And our standards have gone down because it used not to be the case. Partly the politics of what's happening, and partly because the electronic media have made it rather too easy. I'm afraid we do have anti-Semitism in the UK. I don't think it's worse than anywhere else, but we do have it. And I'm delighted that the German ambassador to the UK has been very much in evidence at events commemorating the Holocaust. He had a seminar in the German embassy on anti-Semitism. He's gone out of his way. And I do, despite the difficulties you have with one of your political parties in Germany, I do pay a tribute to Germany for the efforts you've made to come to terms with your past. And I think you've done it pretty well. So well done. We also have Islamophobia. I think we all have to tackle that. But there are good things as well. I was invited some months ago to speak to a school in the East End of London. It was an all-boys school. I think every boy was a Muslim. And the project they were working in was the Holocaust. These are Muslim boys, the Holocaust and the Kindertransport. And when the questions came along, one of the Muslim boys said to me, he asked, what does one say to somebody who denies the Holocaust ever happened? Interesting. This is from a Muslim school, Muslim boys. So there are positive things happening. Unfortunately, in the public media, this is not understood, that the Muslim community in Britain is doing great things. Minority are not, but the majority are, as are the majority of most communities, and the minorities are also doing bad things. So I take comfort from that visit to that Muslim school, and I take comfort from other events I've been to, whether it's talking to the faith communities, Christians, Jews, about refugees, Muslim communities. There's a very positive response, so it's not all as bad as it might be. But I think there are three headings under which I would think we ought to move forward. First and foremost is education. We've heard that referred to already. Education is crucial, how we teach people. And I think we have in Britain something called the Holocaust Education Trust. It's a voluntary organization that gets government support. I was at their event. They have an annual event for young people they call their ambassadors, who are taken to Auschwitz and are then taught these things, and then they go to the schools and they spread the word as young people, as ambassadors. Fantastic people. And I went to such an event, and I said, the Holocaust Education Trust does a good job. It is intended to make sure that the memory of the past is kept alive, and we look forward to the future, and we look forward to the future without discrimination, without racism, and all the other things we're criticizing today. So education is one. Secondly, we need legislation. We can talk about the legislation in our countries. There has to be legislation against discrimination. There has to be legislation against hate speech. These things must be against the law. The law doesn't wipe them out, but at least it sets the standard by which our societies should be judged. So we need tough legislation. One of the things we have in the UK is something called the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And this is an area where they operate. And I have to say, before anybody asks questions about it, there are allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which I find shameful. Not many, but a minority. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission is actually looking at anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. For heaven's sake, what a state we've got to. But isn't it good we have the Equality and Human Rights Commission to do an independent investigation of this? And lastly, and I'll finish here, is public opinion. One of the things I've felt all along in campaigning on behalf of child refugees and in these other issues is we have to keep public opinion on side as much as possible. It's difficult, but we have to remember, we talk to each other here, we all think the same. But when we leave here, we have to make sure we address these issues to the wider public. People who are not necessarily converted. We have to spread the word. I'll tell you one nice little story, then I'll finish with that. I was talking about anti-Semitism and Kindertransport and refugees, a small place outside London. And 3 of the schools had got together during Refugee Week. And at this commuter railway station, they were giving out coffee, free croissant, to all the commuters with a collection box for refugees. Pretty good gesture.
One of the recommendations that came out of the Berlin conference that has been reinforced is that when acts occur of hate, anti-Semitism or the like, there's a responsibility of leaders to speak out. Well, Lord Dubs, no one would ever accuse you of not speaking out in this regard. So thank you for your courageous leadership on these issues. I want to acknowledge Germana Shida, who's here from ODIHR. She'll have a chance to speak later at the end of to sort of summarize. She'll get the last word. And before opening it up, I would like to just acknowledge Misha from our staff, who's done so much work on this particular event. Thank you very much for your help. With that, I'm going to start with Congressman Hoyer, who's the majority. With Congressman Hoyer as the majority leader of the House of Representatives. He's also, as pointed out in the plenary session, one of the founders of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly.
There it is. Thank you very much, Senator Cardin. And I want to thank all of the speakers who gave us a very thoughtful presentation and I think a very compelling presentation. And Lord Dubs, thank you very much for doing what I think is absolutely essential. Under the Helsinki Final Act, we quickly think about looking at another nation or another people's. And it's more difficult to look at ourselves. The Bible talks about that, the speck in the eye of your opponent and the plank in your own eye. I think it is critical that all of our countries be self-introspective with respect to what is happening in our own nations. Because as Senator Cardin pointed out, sadly, tragically, but we learned from millennia of history that hate and prejudice and division is a common trait to, frankly, all people. We've experienced that tragically in the United States. We had a great civil war in our country because we treated people of color as less than human. A guy named Brian Stevenson is an African American in our country who has made it his life's work to try to ensure that people, because of the color of their skin or their economic status, are not railroaded legally into prison. The root of all evil, it's said, is money. But the root of so much conflict in our country through the millennia, and in our countries, our world, our globe, has been the sense that someone different from us is less than us. Some of you heard me speak at the opening or at the 4th of July party that Ambassador Evans gave, and I pointed out that, yes, it's the celebration of America's independence, but it is also very much a celebration of the declaration of that independence, in which we said that we adopted a premise. It was a radical premise in its time and frankly in many places right now, and that was that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, and we would say women today, are created equal. If we believed that, we would not denigrate others. If we believed that, the appeal by people for political success by denigrating others, blaming others for the problems that people experience, would be far less. America is experiencing that challenge today. And hopefully we will overcome it as we have in the past. The Congress of the United States over the last, the House of Representatives has passed an Equality Act, which said that we were adding to our anti-discrimination legislation discrimination against those who are of the LGBT community. Frankly, gays in my country were the last group that it was still respectable to say bigoted things against. I don't mean that people don't say bigoted things still against people of color, women, LGBT, Catholics, Protestants, whatever. What I mean is that it has become, as my friend knows, not acceptable in company to talk about people of color in a derogatory way. But until recently, it was not the case of gays, lesbians, transgender. So this is very much, in my opinion, at the root of much of the conflict and confrontation we see in the world. When the Soviet Union, in my experience, when the Soviet Union imploded, and it imploded because of our continued expression of ideals consistent with the final act in many respects. Also economically, its system didn't work. But the fact is, the world became more complicated. Did somebody cut me off? Should I be suspicious? No, I won't go there. When the world became less than bipolar, when it was this side in the Cold War and this side, people were frozen in place. But once that dam broke, we saw Yugoslavia break apart. We saw other nations, and we were 35, we're now 57. Much of that was because of nationalism and ethnic and religious differences that you spoke of, Senator. So I believe this organization has an extraordinarily important role to play. I think this panel has an extraordinary contribution to make because unless we respect one another, unless we believe at our core that all of us are created equal, we will continue to have conflict. We will continue to have confrontation, and we will continue to have violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Hoyer. Nahima Landry is going to have to leave. She's chairing her own committee starting in a few minutes on migration. So thank you very much for your participation, and we wish you best in the committee's work.
Thank you.
Oh, this is no disrespect to Congressman Hoyer. I've been told we set a 2-minute limit on interventions, but. The floor is open for discussion.
We have different members.
Yes, please. If you identify yourself, we would appreciate it.
Hetty Fry, Canada. I'm head of the Canadian delegation. I think that the word that for me, anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, these are things that we know, we name clearly. Intolerance covers a multitude of sins. And I think that's when we need to talk about xenophobia. Just not liking the other, being leery of the other, being afraid of the other. I think this is really important. I think we all agree on what we need to talk about here. I think we all agree on the terminology, etc. I think the most important thing that countries need to do, and in Canada, I would like to say that we do not have massive demonstrations of hate. We do not have massive demonstrations of violence against other. We do. Recently, we've seen a rise in this. But I think the way to deal with this, as we said, I think it's a very clear pathway that Canada had followed. The first thing we did was legislation. Of course, we have our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is very similar to your Constitution. And Section 15 says that you cannot discriminate against anybody because of, and it names everything. Racism, language, ethnicity, color, religion, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on an exhaustive list that keeps getting added to. So it's clearly unconstitutional to do this. But that is the first piece, and that feeds other things. We have a strong Citizenship and Immigration Act. We have a strong Multicultural Act. We have a strong anti-hate legislation. We have strong Canadian Criminal Code, crimes against state. But the important thing is that those stem from our Constitution. They're pieces of our Constitution. And if you don't have legislation that clearly states the kind of society you wish to create, because that's what legislation does, you also need to back that up with strong, solid policies and good programs that are going to be able to deal with some of the things you want to achieve. But key to that, and before we talk about anything else, I think it's important to talk about public education and awareness. I think, and good data. You cannot go anywhere, you cannot inform yourself unless you know what's happening, unless you have good data. And Statistics Canada collects data. And I just wanted to tell you quickly that in 2014, this is what we talk about when we talk about hate crimes. We have found out that our hate crimes between 2014 and 2017 has gone up 47%. Now, that sounds horrendous. However, that turns out to be 1% of all non-traffic crimes in Canada. So we're talking here relatively. But for a country like ours, which was built, like the United States, on diversity, on people coming from every part of the world to create a new world, a new land, it's very interesting that we went a different way. Multiculturalism encourages people to maintain their sense of identity, their language, their culture, and all of the things that make them unique, their religion, etc., and to openly display that wherever they choose. So it's against the law to stop anyone from doing that. As a result, we've brought in employment legislation, employment equity, where you cannot discriminate or not give a job to someone openly. Of course, we know that lots of these things happen for different reasons. We get reasons why we didn't hire somebody. We never say it's because of their race. But those are the things you cannot stop someone from being employed under. I think it's important when you build a country like ours, and I know that this does not pertain to Europe, but Europe is facing migration today, and we are countries of migration. We found that it was really important to use policies that help to identify what are the barriers that people face because of their race, sexual orientation, gender, color, religion, etc. Identify those specifically, and then start programs and policies to remove them, to help those groups to overcome those barriers. So we're talking good public policy here. As a result, we find that when we talk about hate crimes increasing, and that still represents 0.1% of all non-traffic crimes in our country, it tells us to some extent we are relatively successful. One of the first things we do is the day you arrive in our country, regardless of whether you're a citizen or you're not a citizen, if you're a refugee or not, you are completely protected by the Constitution. You have equal access to every single thing that Canadian citizens have access to. So this makes it an equal society immediately. And then to keep tabs on what's going on is really important. However, it's sad to say that one of the things that we do say in our Multiculturalism Act, it's not sad to say that because it's positive, is that one of the things we want to do is to set up policies that will assist people and the diversity of Canadians to have full participation in the economic, social, cultural, and political life of the country, and to remove barriers that prevent them from getting there. And that is really important because we see people in our parliament and in our public institutions that come from every walk of life, and that are there because they are able to, and we've promoted them to rise to whatever it is they can be in those areas. That means that our population see each other represented in the institutions of the country. That's a good move and a good start. And to make room, institutions have to change. You cannot simply legislate change and say, oh, you cannot discriminate. Institutions, public institutions, have to show the way by not themselves discriminating. They have to show the way by opening the door and making room for. Because institutions are built on tradition. And if you don't break down the tradition within your institutions, that will say that, okay, you can come here wearing a turban. You can walk in here wearing a niqab. You can sit at this table and be a member of parliament wearing a hijab. You can do those things. You can wear a massive cross if you want to on your chest. You can do what you want. You can wear your turban. You can do everything. Because there is no discrimination. When you allow for that openness to occur, you will see change happening. Unfortunately, we are not a perfect nation. We still have a lot of work to do.
Thank you very much. Further interventions? Yes.
First, I want to associate myself with the statements of Mr. Hoyer and the gentle lady from Canada. I also recognize your amendment this morning at this morning's intervention that I thought was perfectly talked about with regards to women and girls and climate change. I want to say, and I also, you picked up on exactly what I was thinking about institutions and institutions having to change. And there should be something that from within that we make sure and mandate that our institutions is a shining example for all of those who are looking in. Because if, in fact, we just wink at the institutions and what's going on and the policies there, and that there's discriminatory practices taken, and we do nothing, and nothing happens, then individuals will look at our legislation as just words and not something that has an effect. It is tremendously important, I think, that if we're talking about ending anti-Semitism or ending racism, or as I've been talking about when we visited Hungary not too long ago, the plight of the Roma. It is also important, I think about my own plight as a young kid and my parents' plight in the civil rights movement. What was significant during the civil rights movement, and I think part of the genius of Dr. King, was that not only did he work, it was only African Americans that were speaking out against racism. It was the partnership that he went with in regards to with Jewish brothers and sisters and others. So it wasn't just the African Americans saying we are being discriminated against. It was others that were saying they are being discriminated against, and that is wrong. So it is important for us when we see someone not from our own group, but someone from another group who's being discriminated against, if we're really going to stop racism. For example, when we think about it, it would only take, in the United States right now, there's an issue that I have a personal problem with. I looked and see that there's a scenario that's taking place with a certain group of individuals within our institution that have a secret society on Facebook talking about immigrants, people of color, Hispanics. Yet those same individuals are still there working. There's something wrong with tolerating individuals because then you feel free to say whatever you want. It should be at a point, and we have a responsibility, I think, in our private circles. Sometimes in our private circles, when we sit around and we hear somebody saying something that's anti-Semitic, it would be my responsibility if I'm with my friends, not when I'm in the public and everybody else, but when I'm with my friends, if I heard my friend say something anti-Semitic, it is my responsibility to stand up and say, you can't say that even in private. Because if you accept it privately, it is something that then becomes systemic in all of our society. So I just say that what this organization, what we got to look at is how important it is for us to make sure that we are speaking and it becomes loudly and clearly that we understand the plight of others who are not like us. When I left Hungary, the whole point I was trying to make with reference to the Roma, because I did not see any Roma in the room at the time. But yet nobody was yelling and screaming about the plight of the Roma, the fact that they are the poorest of the poor, that they're discriminated. It should not be the Roma that have to do that. It should be somebody other than the Roma. Someone who recognizes that and wants to make that difference. And when we're able to do that, then I think that we're on the way of ending racism and anti-Semitism and anti-Islamophobia, and we're then on our way to a better
Congressman Meeks, thank you very, very much. Appreciate your comments. I'm going to recognize Congresswoman Demings, and then I'm going to recognize O'Dear for comments, because I think...
Thank you so much, Senator Cardin, and thank you to all of our presenters today. What a important topic we are discussing today. Senator, you started this discussion off talking about or recognizing or helping us to remember Jews praying in a synagogue. And then you went to blacks, African Americans praying in a church. I would like to add members of the LGBTQ community celebrating in a nightclub in Orlando. I represent the district that the Pulse nightclub is located in. I think what is so important for us to realize when we talk about freedom of speech and then hate speech and discrimination is as much of a weapon as any traditional weapons of war. Many people will say to you that words do not hurt. Well, when they lead to violence, that results in death, when they lead to human beings, and I do agree with you, leader, all people are created equal, and if we really do believe that, when hate speech and actions and discrimination lead to human beings being left behind, that is not the kind of country we want in the United States of America, and that is not the kind of world that we should want or ever tolerate. I heard you say a couple of things, that number one, we have to call it for what it is. But number two, that freedom of speech ends when freedom of speech ends when hate speech begins. And it goes back to the gentleman from New York, what he said, we cannot tolerate, whether it's anti-Semitic, whether it's discrimination against Jews, women, blacks, boys, we have to have zero tolerance. But what I want us to think about too is that this can not only be the responsibility, and I'll end with this, of government, that we have to create an environment where that includes the private sector as well. When we think about how hate is now carried, and you talked about Lord Dubs, I believe it is, from the UK, the posting, social media, or social media giants also, I believe, have a tremendous role to play in how we send a strong message that we will not tolerate hate or discrimination in the world. So thank you so very much.
Let me recognize Germana from the representing O'Dear for any observations she might have in regards to the presentations.
Thank you very much. It is my honor and privilege to be here today and try to very briefly comment on what we've heard, and I think most urgently present what we at O'Dear do in terms of you maybe getting to know a bit more about our tools and our work, so that when the chance is there, you can use some of our tools or contact us so that we can share some of our, be it recommendations, be it education materials, be it leaflets or trainings that we have and that are at your disposal. I come from a department that's called Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department, and our mandate very broadly tackles on anti-Semitism, intolerance against Muslims, intolerance against Christians, members of other religions, racism, xenophobia, and other types of intolerances. Very briefly, I will inform you about the current project that we just finalized, Words into Action project, which was mentioned several times in a very positive light today. It is a project focusing on anti-Semitism with three very, very strong components. focusing on educational component, then the security component, security of Jewish communities component, and a very important component, which is also coalition building. We heard a lot today about the need for coalition building, for establishing strong coalitions, all of us together, responding together to be it individual incidents of hatred, be it communal ones, and we've seen that this is a very helpful tool to bring communities together and try and build coalitions around fighting hate. We are hoping that very soon we will also have a second phase of this project, which was generously supported by the German government, as mentioned before, but we are hoping we will be continuing with this project in the years to come as well. What I would like to mention is briefly, so there are tools that deal with security of Jewish communities and the fight against hate crimes for Jewish communities, but also we will be drafting similar tools for other communities. So if there is interest in that, please come to us, write to us. We are happy to share these tools. Equally, when it comes to education tools, we have teaching materials to combat against anti-Semitism in schools, in classrooms, trying to help teachers to use the materials to enter into classrooms and use these tools that also cover, broadly speaking, racism, intolerances, and xenophobia. We are quite famous, I would say, for our work on hate crimes. I would just like to remind you that we do have a palette of tools and trainings that we offer officially for law enforcement, for prosecutors, and also for civil society sector, be it individual communities, be it offering trainings across the board for diverse communities that can then afterwards create coalitions around concretely fighting hate crimes. We are also famous for hosting biggest global database on hate crimes, as you know, and we do ask all countries officially to submit your data or official data on hate crimes, which we gather and put up on the website, which can be accessed, and at any time you can see what is the situation with recorded and reported hate crimes and prosecuted hate crimes in each individual state. Adding to that, we also accept and we ask civil society to submit to us and international organizations hate incidents so that our statistics is not only official statistics, but also statistics coming from communities themselves. Also, on a personal note, being a Bosnian Muslim, I used to be a child refugee, someone who was fleeing war, and someone who has seen also what hate speech and hate crime and intolerant discourses do bring to particular communities. And on that behalf, I would like to conclude this very brief presentation of ours. We're happy to cooperate with you. We're happy to stay in contact with you. If there is any of our tools that we are currently working on, we're happy to share. Or if there is something along the lines of your recommendations that you think we could be working on more and maybe drafting further tools or other things, leaflets, publications that might be helpful, please do contact us. Thank you very much.
Shermana, thank you very much. As I said at the beginning of the session, my objective as special representative is to share best practices and what we can do. And certainly part of that is capacity building. ODIHR has services that are available to all of us. And we want to make sure that each member state understands the services of ODIHR in helping you deal with education, helping you deal with Holocaust education, helping you deal with capacity building in your own country. We heard from Canada what they're doing in their country on capacity building. So take advantage of those resources. I think we've really underscored very important points. Congressman Meeks, your point about coalition building is critically important. If we're not united, we're not going to succeed. And if any group's not safe, none of us are safe. We know that. A lot of the hate speech may be directed towards one particular minority group. Every minority group suffers from that speech. We recognize that, and we have not been as strong as we need to in getting the coalitions together. I want to thank particularly the German delegation for a couple reasons. First, your point about necessary laws is absolutely accurate about hate speech, and we need to deal with that. But as Lord Dubs pointed out, Germany has come to grips with its past, and so many countries have yet to come to grips with their past. And if you can't come to grips with your past, you can't move to the future. So I think that was an important point that was made. There's a long list. I'm not going to go through the entire list of great comments that were made. I do believe we are all leaders, and we must speak out and be leaders in making sure our state follows up on an agenda to deal with the seeds that are out there. The statements made about the comparisons to history are frightening. If you weren't sobered by the original presentation about how close we are in some details to what we saw before World War II, then you shouldn't be here. Because I think all of us recognize that we do have troubling seeds there. We are very confident we can contain it, but that confidence only works if we have an agenda to deal with it. If we ignore it and say it's someone else's problem or it will go away, then we do run the risk of very extreme actions in our own individual countries. So I want to thank all of you for participating. This is what I think the Parliamentary Assembly is about, taking the best ideas of each of our delegations and working towards a plan of action in the OSCE region, which I think will have global significance. And please join me in thanking our panelists one more time for their presentation.